Ladies and gentlemen, will the congregation please rise?
Please be seated. Really lovely to be here among friends and colleagues from a long time ago, so a really warm welcome to this lovely inaugural lecture on a really nice Johannesburg afternoon. A little bit hot, but has cooled off very nicely. So it's really nice to see familiar faces, students, staff, and colleagues. But let me do this absolutely properly. So my name's Ruxana Osman. I'm the Senior Deputy Vice Chancellor, and I have the pleasure of presiding over this inaugural. It's a particular pleasure because Lee has been a colleague from a long time ago, and I've had the opportunity to observe Lee's work and read some of Lee's work. So it's really an exciting moment. I want to extend a really warm welcome to everyone who's here, but let me start first with the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Professor Mucha Musemwa. I want to go to Professor Nadine Peterson, who's the Executive Dean at University of Johannesburg, and we're most appreciative that you're presenting yourself today, and we'll do the vote of thanks. It's always nice when two universities in close proximity to each other, doing different work, but are able to participate in events like this, celebratory event, in fact. So warm welcome to you. And then to Professor Juliet Perumal, who's the head of the School of Education, one of the largest schools in the university after clinical medicine, I think. And then, of course, yourself, Professor Lee Rusznyak. Everyone's looking forward to today. You've done some really interesting work over the long period of time, but particularly over the last 5 to 10 years. So a very warm welcome to you. And it's a wonderful opportunity in an inaugural lecture to actually use it as a moment to acknowledge friends, colleagues, students, all who've contributed to who you are today. So a really warm welcome to you. But of course, the welcomes are not complete, and I really want to extend a very warm welcome to Ed and Anne Brunette. A very proud moment for you, and we thank you for giving Lee to us. So a very warm welcome to you. And then Greg, Timothy, and Matthew. This could never happen without the three of you. It simply couldn't. So a very warm welcome to you. I want to extend colleagues from the School of Education who've come out in full force, and that must make you feel very nicely to have that kind of support. Colleagues from other universities are attending. And then there's the Department of Higher Education and the Department of Basic Education, the South African Council of Education, which is SACE, teacher unions, members from the Joint Education, JET Education Services, the Jakes Gerwel Fellowship, and the Xanax Foundation. That gives you an indication of the range of Lee's work and the different organizations that she works with. There's also members of the LCT Hub, who are here, and the wider academic community. I also want to welcome many people who have joined us online, and there are so many people that have joined online. I want to extend a particular welcome to Professor Elizabeth Walton, who's been formerly in the School of Education, now at the University of Nottingham, but remains a very good friend of the School of Education. So a very warm welcome to you, Elizabeth. Marissa, I acknowledge you, long-standing colleague in the school, very warm welcome. I see Professor Maureen Robinson, who's traveled from far away. Maureen, a really warm welcome to you, former dean at Stellenbosch University, so a really warm welcome to you. I see lots of colleagues from other faculties as well. So Lee, clearly your work is resonating with people out there. So warm welcome to everyone who's here, to family, friends, and people who have joined online. The next part of the procession, or the next part of the proceedings, will be dealt with by the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities. And what he'll really do is introduce you to Professor Rusznyak. He'll introduce you to the vote, to Professor Nadine Peterson, who will do the vote of thanks. And then we give you a very small present to acknowledge your very big contribution to the scholarship of this university. So again, join me in welcoming Professor Lee Rusznyak. Mucha, over to you.
A very good afternoon to you all. I used to teach, and when my students did not respond enthusiastically to what I was going to teach them on that day, I didn't enjoy the lecture. So, I'm not giving a lecture, but a good afternoon to you all. Ah, that's better. This is a good occasion. We should all be happy, right? All right, without further ado, I just want to introduce our inaugural professor, or inaugurating professor, sometimes the language goes. So I begin by simply telling you that Lee is all in all a Wetsi for life. A connection to Wets began in 1988 when she started a Bachelor of Science degree. For the past 27 years, she has served in many roles, including coordinator at Medhurst Student Residence, head of the Teaching Experience Office, and she served as deputy head of school for 8 years. Lee focuses her teaching and research on preparing student teachers for the classroom. She has partnered with JET Education Services and the Xenex Foundation on various national research projects, including working with the South African Council for Educators, SACE, to develop national professional teaching standards. Lee also leads a special interest group on teacher education with the South African Education Researchers Association. She is currently collaborating with the Jacques Howell Fellowship to build a support program for newly qualified teachers. Lee is based in the Curriculum and Social Studies Division, and she is the director of the Wits LCT Hub. She is a proud member of the UNESCO Chair in Teacher Education for Diversity and Development. It is now my singular honor to invite Professor Lee Rusznyak to give your lecture. Thank you.
Professor Osman, Professor Mucha, Professor Peterson, Professor Perumal, colleagues, friends, family, I am delighted to share this experience with you, and I'm just so grateful for joining me in this event to mark this moment. It means a huge amount to me, and I'm truly honored and incredibly touched. So everybody has experienced classroom life, and it's easy to think of teaching as something ordinary, something that you do if you don't actually do what you really want to do. I was probably born with a piece of chalk in my hand. True as Bob, I often find chalk still in every jacket I wear. We tell people that you're a born teacher because you're so good with kids. After all of us have taught somebody to make a sandwich, tie your shoelaces, clean your bedroom. Yes. change a wheel, make toast. We've all been in a teaching situation. The idea of a born teacher suggests that what you need to be a teacher is innate. If you just put yourself in that environment, you'll figure it out. And through experience, you'll also find what works for you, what doesn't work for you, and eventually you'll make it happen. My first year students, I ask them every year, how many of you already know how to teach? They raise their hand without fail. They say all they need is the certificate. I'm going to show in this speech why my research suggests that becoming a teacher is not just an easy process of figuring it out for yourself. Certainly not in a South African context where we need an excellent quality teacher in every classroom for every child. So first, I'm just going to say that I'm going to deal with three big issues in this talk. The first is I'm going to show a little bit of empirical research about why I think that the idea of a born teacher is actually a myth. Secondly, I want to show how we start to see teaching not as ordinary, but as extraordinary. And then I'm going to make an argument for why I think that we need a sociological approach to deepen our understanding of what teachers do, what teachers are in the education sector. So first, a little bit about my background. I grew up surrounded by teachers. My dad fostered my love of nature, of science, of stars, of birds. He used to sit with me and just show me the magic and then the scientific ideas that helped me to understand what I was seeing. So he fostered my love of science. My mother and my aunt talked about classroom life incessantly. And I found those conversations fascinating. I loved watching small children play. I babysat. I loved seeing how children learn through play. And truly, there was no other career that I could imagine myself doing. I grew up in apartheid South Africa, the 1960s, 70s, 80s, when schooling was racially segregated and grossly unequal. I attended local public schools with other white kids in the neighborhood. And you can see there was Waverley Girls High School. I came to Wits with the intention of doing a BSc followed by a one-year diploma. You know, in those days, now I think it's called a PGCE. Well, I got to the end of my BSc and I decided, no. I don't want my primary interest to be physics and science and astronomy and geography, earth science and so on. I really, really want to learn how to teach. And so I went back to first year, started a B.Prim Ed. And during the B.Prim Ed, we were taught the principles of people's education. People's education for people's power, and how education can be a tool to oppress, but also how it can be a tool for liberation. And I think it's summed up in Mandela's claim that education is the most powerful weapon that we can use to change the world. And I really felt that there was this huge commitment in my lecturers, in the colleagues who were with me, including Ella Mokhalani, who is now the CEO of SACE. During our B.Ed, we learned how schooling had been structured to support apartheid. And we learned about resistance from civil society and how that could bring change to oppressive political regimes. We were introduced to multicultural and anti-racist pedagogies. And to disrupt our experiences of segregated schooling, we spent extended time observing and teaching in Soweto schools, and I particularly went to St. Matthew's School in Rockville. So in apartheid's dying days, when I'd now finished my studies, I started my teaching career in a very sparsely resourced community schools, public school, on the outskirts of Alexandra Township. And to empower the children in my class, the 60 kids I had in my class, I could not teach the same as I was taught. I had to do better. I had to teach them a different kind of education that would help them to be literate, knowledgeable people who could participate in really important conversations about their world, their lives, and the planet. So the question became, how do I teach to empower the most vulnerable learners sitting in front of me? And as much as I loved being a science and geography and language and music teacher, I adored having student teachers come to do their practicals in my class. And I knew there and then that my heart and my future lay in preparing teachers for South African classrooms. And this really informs my quest that has driven my work since my PhD up to this day. And that is this: what enables or constrains student teachers who are learning to teach in a context of inequality? And then how do we use this knowledge to improve teacher preparation? So my research interests span the transitions that teachers make from being a learner into teacher education, through teacher education, the interrelationships between what they learn in the classroom and what they learn at university in their coursework. The transition from a student teacher out of university to becoming a newly qualified teacher, transitions from a newly qualified teacher into the workplace as classroom teachers and perhaps as researchers of practice-based teaching that can inform their teaching. So over the last 25 years, I've really looked at each of these parts systematically. But today, I'm going to focus my talk only on that transition between school and into teacher education and how we prepare student teachers for the workplace, to go back to school, but to see something different that they've never seen before. So unlike students who are studying architecture, engineering, dentistry, student teachers have spent many years in their future workplace. They've watched what teachers say and do. Chances are, if your teachers were anything, your learners were anything like mine were, they brilliantly mocked their teachers and helped other children with their homework. Because it's so familiar, they tend to regard teaching as ordinary, something anyone can do, and something that you actually don't need anything specialist to do. But really excellent teaching takes a lot of behind-the-scenes work, and good teachers make it seem effortless. So my question is, what do student teachers think they're going to do when they become teachers at the start of their teacher education? And so cognitive metaphor theory suggests that a way of accessing the tacit assumptions of your beliefs. A very powerful way to do that is to construct an analogy and to analyze the grounds on which the comparison is made. So one out of many, many things that we do with the first years in the first week or two of their their Bachelor of Education, is we ask them, being a teacher is like choose another kind of job, and tell us why you say that it's a little bit like that. And you can see the kind of analogies that they draw on, especially social worker, very, very prominent. Typical answers that we get from the students, it's being a mother, because a mother's got to give you advice and help you with your life problems. Now, of course, the care work is part of being a teacher. But if that's all they do, they're not going to become literate, knowledgeable through schooling. A tour guide, because they tell information. Again, it offers a partial view of teaching, and each of these have got elements of truth, but none of them capture the complexity of how teachers work with knowledge, with children in an environment, and make learning happen, organizing it. So when we look at the whole cohort, those were just two examples, 42% of students in our studies focused exclusively on the care work that teachers give. And those students, if we don't disrupt that, they are going to sacrifice curriculum coverage to motivate the children and help them solve their problems at every point. Again, those who see teaching as giving the necessary information, telling them what they need to know, are totally oblivious to the different ways that students might learn or not learn. And when we actually look about what's the purpose of schooling, what was really came out strongly is that the purpose of schooling is to give the children marks so they can pass at the end of the year. It's very mark-driven. And that, again, is not the kind of teacher that is going to be able to really empower children, the kind of teachers our children need and deserve. So it's all very well to say, well, you know, this is what they say in the metaphors, but does this in any way affect how they make sense of classroom life? So this is the next study. So what we did was we were really interested to see, after 12 years, maybe more, of students being with teachers all day, every day, watching teachers teach, how much do they notice? What do they notice? What don't they notice? And so in one study, what we've done is we asked student teachers to watch the same lesson at the very, very start of their their Bachelor of Education, their B.Ed, to answer two simple questions. What's happening in the lesson? And what does the teacher do and why? And when we looked at the results are astounding. So I'm going to give you one example. If you have a look at this particular typical response, this student, like most others, mentions the topic and then never talks about the topic again. Talks about a blow-by-blow account of what the teacher does. Now the teacher's doing this, now the children are doing that, now the teacher's doing this. When they give reasons for what the teacher's doing, it's always to help the children understand. And it's not a nuanced sense of a differentiated sense of what teachers do. Everything's to help them understand. So I used some tools from LCT to plot the complexity of the response, ranging from no mention of the teacher at all, as if the teacher's just a passive person in the classroom, to just a simple account of the actions, to giving a reason, however simple, to actually having an integrated sense of the teacher's work, where it's not just fragments of activity, but rather this is the purpose, and she's doing all these different things to reach that purpose. And at the beginning of the year, over the entire cohort, the students are giving atomistic descriptions of teacher actions. And where they do give reasons, they undifferentiated and seldom move past to help the children understand. If you look at the entire cohort, this was just one example, they focus on three things: the classroom routines, how the teacher hands out books or keeps the children quiet or whatever. The children activities, they're doing this, now the children are doing that, now they're doing something else, and the way that the teacher and the children interact. Now, very often, I think that is what is prime in your head when you are a learner at school. They haven't learned to see teaching from the other side of the classroom. And what I want to suggest, and how they evaluate the success of a lesson is the learners have fun, or the learners were all participating, as if fun and participating is a worthwhile learning experience. Maybe it is, that would be great. But that's how they judge the quality of the lesson. What do they seldom notice? And I think that what they would need to notice to get a full view of teaching as a practice is the conceptual progression of ideas through various activities, through various strategies. And to start seeing teachers not just as somebody who's telling, or somebody who's caring, or somebody who's nice and kind and patient, but rather somebody who is taking active decisions to organize learning in a particular sequence, to take the kids from what they know to some sort of deeper understanding. And if they're not seeing that, they're not seeing the wood for the trees. Now, you would think that these kind of problems, surely they resolve themselves, just give them a little bit of experience, give them a little bit of coursework, and those sort of problems would resolve themselves by themselves. Surely they just need to be in the environment, it'll all become clear. Well, my doctoral research suggests that that doesn't happen for a lot of the time. My study looked at teaching practice feedback and evaluation given to an entire cohort of students from their first year of teaching to their last year of teaching through a B Ed. I interviewed lecturers, I interviewed students, and I analysed the teaching practice feedback and assessments. Some of them, yes, absolutely, they found their feet and they plodded along. They plodded along nicely. But many, many students struggled to make sense of classroom life. It wasn't as simple as they expected, and they couldn't sense what was actually going right, what was going wrong. So what they tended to do was to become more and more strict, focusing on classroom control to try and gain some kind of authority. Eventually, if they found a lesson that worked, they used that lesson as a recipe, regardless of the subject, regardless of the content, regardless of the needs of the kids, and that became the security blanket that they would hold on to. Now, you would think that over time, maybe they would learn to let their security blanket go on. I found no. I found actually that they clung harder and harder, and those practices became cemented. And I'll never forget Mary Metcalf, who was head of school at that point, called me into her office and said, "Well done, you've got a PhD now, so I suppose that means that you're going to we need to move you into postgraduates." And I said to her, "No, please don't. Please move me to the first years. Let's get first years right. Let's introduce them to a more sophisticated idea of what teaching's all about. Let's give them the tools they need to make sense of what they see and what they do, and then we can, we don't have to do crisis management with our fourth years." And so that's how our course, Becoming a Teacher, was born, through that. What we also did was to think about every aspect of work-based learning, the curriculum, how they were working, what kind of messages were they sending to students about what quality teaching really means. And so the very first, before I get there. It's not enough that students just learn a whole lot of knowledge and have a whole lot of experience in the classroom and just kind of hope somehow that it all comes together and somehow just one informs the other. It doesn't happen unless you design it. And a paper that I think really puts this out was written by Carol Bertram and myself, where we argue for the importance of not just letting students see teachers' actions, but also opening up the internal mechanisms of teaching and letting them see what's on the inside, making the teacher thinking explicit, making their decision-making explicit. Because when you can see what the decisions people are making, you can start to challenge them, question them. But when you just have the outside routines, you don't get to those internal mechanisms. So I kind of saw it as looking at beyond the face of the teacher into the actual thinking and really see what makes the teaching tick. So where did we start? The first thing that we did was to revise our teaching experience or teaching practice assessment rubrics. And many of you were part of that analysis and investigation that we did. In those days, the idea was send students to school as quickly as possible so that they can go back and they can see what it's like, but they don't. We were using rubrics where a whole lot of criteria were listed, and we had to mark students as being on a scale of A to E. Now, when I was interviewing students in my PhD, in my doctoral study, they were saying there were two things that they were really, really frustrating them. And the first is that my idea of excellence is different to your idea of excellence. And their different tutors, different teacher mentors would give them, the tutor would give them an A and the teacher would give them a C or vice versa. And they couldn't understand why. The other thing that they found very frustrating was, okay, so I'm a B. What do I need to do to get an A? And what this kind of rubric does is it obscures the grounds of achievement by situating it all in the subjective views of the assessor. So I drew on my doctoral work and we developed a differently formatted rubric where we looked at criteria, and each of the criteria came from Lee Schulman's model of pedagogical reasoning and action. And we looked at 4 levels of competence, from being not yet competent to the emergence of competence to a skilled competence. You can show that you can do it, but you don't really know why you're doing it. And then that PCK, the pedagogical content knowledge, informed, thoughtful, reasoned practice where they're doing it well and they know why. And what we did was we put empirical descriptors into what does this look like in a whole range of criteria. The rubric has been used by universities across the country. I know that many other universities have also redone their rubrics from a kind of a checklist to this kind of format in light of this research that Carol and I did. And I've also done recent work to extend it and update it to include insightful, reflexive competence that one can expect of an excellent newly qualified teacher. The Jake Gerwel Fellowship is currently using this grid to track the quality of teaching of newly qualified teachers in a support program. It's also being used as the basis for TICSA to develop a teacher competency framework for students who are doing extended internships. The next thing, we turned our attention to how students were planning lessons. Now, in those days, we gave them a template to fill in, and they had to tick which strategies they would be using and all kinds of things. Students regarded lesson planning as paperwork. It was the paperwork that you do because the lecturer demands it. There was no essence of value in it. And if you have a look at this genuine example, we noticed that frequently students would write up their lesson steps like a generic recipe that makes nothing in particular. Some, like this one, gave no attention whatsoever to how he imagined working to unpack the concept of photosynthesis and make it accessible to children in his class and relevant. This approach to lesson planning was not in any way contributing to the development of their pedagogical reasoning. In fact, lesson plans like this are mere paperwork. No value aside from bureaucratic compliance. So with the Teaching Experience Committee, we set out to really think about what would it take to design a lesson plan that moves the student teachers very systematically through a decision-making process that conceptualizes a learning experience in a coherent, deep way. Now, we know that once teachers become very experienced, they don't need to do absolutely detailed blow-by-blow lesson plans. But that's not true of a student teacher who is learning the logics of the practice, those internal mechanisms. So, after much research and really relying heavily on Wally Morrow's work, Marissa's work of many other colleagues, we looked at number one. The first step is asking them to articulate what content knowledge they want the kids to know by the end of the lesson. And that doesn't just mean they're going to learn about democracy. It means democracy is a system of government that to actually articulate it. Very often the students were telling us that they stand in front of the class and they go blank. But because they've already actually written the key ideas, they've found the way that the ideas work, the connections work. So articulating the content for the lesson was for us a crucial starting point. And content knowledge is the foundation on which PCK builds. And that is the knowledge of how to teach this content to these kids in this context. So the next thing we asked them to do is to consider learner diversity. Now, not all aspects of learner diversity are equally relevant to every lesson. So we asked them to think about not just learner diversity in general, but what learner diversity is significant, pedagogically significant, do you need to take into consideration in this lesson? And I just want to give you one example. Showing children in Johannesburg a picture of a snowman during, on a lesson in winter is not pedagogically appropriate. These kids are not used to playing in the snow in winter. Our winters look sunny skies and no clouds. So it's that kind of thing that we really wanted them to think about, the significant aspects of learner diversity, and then to consider their pedagogic options. We could do this, we could do that, but which ones and which sequence of them is going to make up the most productive learning experience? So all of those then go to the how you do it. And it's on the basis of that that you can now start thinking about a sequence of lesson steps that really deal with unpacking this concept, linking to examples, making it relevant. What ideas, what main ideas are you wanting to learn? And what do you want the children to do with that knowledge? So this was not merely a lesson plan. It was actually a rationale for the design of their lessons, because here what we wanted to do was to foreground not just the recipe steps, but the reasons for why teachers do what they do. And if you can sometimes our students were making, were giving good reasons, but actually making different, not the best decisions. And because that reasoning was explicit, we could have those conversations, which we couldn't have with just the lesson steps. And this was something that we argued would be a pathway to build their pedagogical content knowledge. The third concern that I'm going to just mention was how pre-service teachers were reflecting on their classroom experiences. Now, many realize that in a professional degree, they're expected to draw on insights from their coursework to reflect on their classroom experiences, but it's not clear to everyone. And even third year, this was a third year student I took from his reflection. He was just giving a blow-by-blow account of the lesson without really much substance. And we really grappled with what was going wrong, because the questions we asked them to follow was, how did the lesson go and what would you do differently next time? And what we realized is that those questions gave the students tunnel vision. They gave the students tunnel vision into their classroom experience as if that was the only thing that they needed to reflect on. What it did was it made their insights from their coursework belong to a different world that was not belonging in this space. So we had to rethink those questions. And how we did that was we really looked at what was the shifting we want from lecture room to classroom, from classroom to lecture room. And so in the first paper there, we developed a set of replacement prompts, and in the second paper, we show what actually happened when the students used the second prompts to reflect on instead of the first. So, just a taste. What concepts from university or from wherever else you've learned help me to understand the incidents, the successes, the failures that I've seen or I've experienced in the classroom? So that's one way of getting that transfer. Another way of getting the transfer was another question that we asked in the set. How is what I know about teaching challenged or extended by what I've seen in the classroom or what I've observed in the classroom? And so it's those deliberate shifts between theory and practice that we're trying to not just hope happens by magic, but actually set up structures to make sure that they happen better. So my focus was very, very much on my students that I was teaching, the problems that we were seeing on teaching experience with the Wit students in Johannesburg schools. And it was great. I thought it was great that some universities out there across South Africa and beyond were really taking up this work and finding it really useful and actually changing their practice, because that's the power of research. You put things out there and it opens up conversations. Now, all that changed in March 2020. When COVID hit, my attention and my concern shifted from the institution to the national. It was obvious that teacher education institutions around the country would soon be facing a crisis as schools closed down under national lockdown. And Jet Education Services arranged an education researchers boot camp to encourage researchers to think about urgent problems in their field and how the disruption caused by the pandemic could provide a chance to build back better. There was this immediate crisis in ensuring how student teachers around the country could fulfill their work-based learning requirements, many of which needed that in order to graduate. But no one person or no one institution could tackle a problem of that magnitude on their own. And if we were doing it, we might as well do it as a sector and address the problem nationally altogether, rather than piecemeal approaches, some that might work and some that don't. Our children that the students teach deserve that. Medium-term concern was that my research and research of others pointed to huge variation in the quality of student learning, both in terms of the coursework that they were doing, but also in terms of very variable experiences in the classroom. In fact, just shortly before the pandemic, Dr. Whitty Green had convened a gathering of stakeholders to consider the problems associated with work-integrated learning and what we could do as a sector to get this working better. The South African Department of Higher Education and Training, together with the European Union, provided funding for the development of materials and a research project that would tackle this problem head on. It was part of a national capacity building project program. It was also supported by SACE and the DBE. And then this year, a grant from the Xenix Foundation has enabled us to continue with the project in this academic year. A team of outstanding teacher educators, many of which I'd worked on in various forums and from the SIERA Special Interest Group in Teacher Education, came together and we accepted this challenge to build back better. And together, we thought about what would need to happen to offer a different model of work integrated learning. The students couldn't learn in practice. Perhaps they could learn from practice, and we could show them the things that they are missing by just going in a classroom, sink or swim, without those conceptual tools to see what they didn't see as learners. So we put together a online module, which was data light, and we got it 0 rated, and we produced a downloadable resource book that had the course materials for students who had intermittent Wi-Fi access or who were part of the deaf community. To date, more than 60,000 student teachers across the country have completed this module as a preparation for their work-based learning. And what we found, before I go into that, we started thinking about how we wanted to frame this course. And we started with the SACE Professional Teaching Standards, standard number 6, which is this: teachers make thoughtful choices about their teaching that lead to learning gains for all learners. It encompassed the social justice aspect that we wanted to bring to the fore, that classroom busyness is not the same as the classroom business of teaching and learning. And also, it really strongly positions the teacher as a decision-making, thoughtful, knowledge-informed practitioner who's got to make strategic decisions. So what we then did was we started off with Wayne Hugo's work on cracking the code, where he builds on Bernstein to consider what are the essential choices that that every teacher needs to make in every classroom. And we started to think which ones of those choices were really relevant to student teachers and which ones hadn't he considered, but we were going to include. And we settled on a design of 6 modules which take the students through the different aspects of teachers' practice and the various choices that they need to make. Now, one of the things that we needed to look at is that obviously there were tensions in designing the program, selecting the knowledge, deciding what sequencing. You can see that classroom management comes right at the end. That was get this other stuff right and your classroom management will be a breeze. It's very, very intentional on how it was sequenced. But this paper talks about those tensions and the strategic choices we had to make in putting together a module that would be suitable for all student teachers across the country. And we thought that it was really important to justify or to explain or to make visible or explicit some of those decisions, some of the tensions we grappled with, for the sake of opening discussion about what it takes to make students ready for classroom-based learning, so that it's not just a simple accumulating hours, but actually has valuable learning experiences, that they've got the tools to figure out what's going on and why. Now, one of the things that struck me was, sorry. As well as, so we had those choices, and what happened here is that teachers across the country came on board and helped us to put together a vision that was Di Parker's vision, articulated in the Education Deans Forum in 2012, if I remember correctly. She wanted a lesson library as a resource for teacher educators. We were able to pull it together. And so this module takes the students through guided and unguided examples of lessons so that they can see these teacher choices being enacted by real teachers in authentic South African classrooms across a range of subjects, grades, and contexts. So what really struck me when we got the data from the research, and we had invited all of these students who participated to make their work available to the team of researchers, what we found, that what I thought had been a problem with Wits students that we had worked on was actually a national issue. And this is an example of a B.Ed student, and you'll see very similar patterns to what I pointed out earlier on. The lesson is focused on reading. The learners underline this. Now they do that. Why? To gain better understanding. And so on. And it's just this fragmented things that the children are doing. This one actually doesn't mention the teacher until right at the end of the lesson observation report. Then he starts, but it's as if the lesson does things all by itself. And it's not a teacher who's actually driving the process. So again, we see this very fragmented, undifferentiated view of classroom teaching. So how do we address that? So one of the things that we did, one of the things in one of the modules, in the Teacher Choices in Action, but it's just to give you a taste, was we wanted to show them how to observe conceptual progression in a lesson. And we did this by including a unit where they looked at semantic waves, and they see how over the course of time, like a lesson, the knowledge changes its context dependence. So when the teacher starts with children's experience, it's very experience near. When she then starts to unpack patterns, it's starting to abstract a little bit. Introducing a concept takes it into less, context far, less context dependent insights, and then going back to examples. And so through looking at the patterns of different shaped semantic waves, the students could start to follow the conceptual progression and start to see why the teacher was doing this activity, then that activity, then something else. Actually, there was a logic. And then what we were able to do is show them those kind of patterns in actual recorded lessons. And I've written this up in a chapter in the book edited by Roxana and Elizabeth Walton, Pedagogical Responsiveness in Complex Context. And sorry, I've gone. What this does is I've argued how an idea like this is really useful in letting the students see what they didn't see when they were children, but also gives them an incredible logic for sequencing lesson steps beyond the mantra, oh, always start with what the children know. And then what? And then where do you go? And this starts to give a very principled but flexible way of putting together sequences of lesson steps. So 3 weeks later, the same student wrote a lesson report on the same lesson. This time giving very much more nuanced, very much more differentiated reasons for what the teacher's doing, and is able to start seeing the patterns of connecting concepts with the children's experience and how that works over time. And you can see from the grey where the student was at first, he has shifted to far more complex observations of classroom practice. So that's all very well and good for the B.Ed students. Well, what about the PGCEs? I mean, they've been at university for 3 years already. Surely, you know, they can do it better. Not so much. We saw exactly the same pattern in a paper that I wrote with Dale Langsford. We looked at PGCE lesson observations before the Teacher Choices in Action module and the complexity of them afterwards. And we could see that they were now able to see not a whole lot of strategies, a whole lot of activities, but actually that conceptual progression. And I really want to argue that until they see that, they're not seeing the full picture of teaching. I love this quote, and I've changed it to my own purposes. Novalis, the German poet, talking about understanding the romanticism of the world. And I think that there's a magic, a mystery, and a wonder of teaching. And to me, bringing the students from school into a teaching education degree or a program or a qualification, they need to see the ordinary as extraordinary. They're convinced that they are familiar with everything a teacher does. They need to start seeing the practice of teaching in strange new ways. And a lot of my work that I do with first years and fourth years and honors students is trying to get them to see the ordinary as extraordinary, the familiar as strange. Now, we've got very well-developed learning theories, mostly from the field of psychology. I think every teacher education program in South Africa that we analysed as part of the initial teacher education research project with Nick Taylor and Jet Education Services said, we saw in the curriculum that they learn about Piaget, they learn about Bruner, they learn about Vygotsky and so on. And those learning theories have crucial implications for teachers. But teaching is not reducible to the processes of learning that happen in children's heads. Teaching has its own logics, its own internal mechanisms, including the work on teacher knowledge, the ethical orientations, the contextual priorities and the contextual responsiveness that teachers need to consider as grounds for pedagogical reasoning and action. And so I think that the next 5 years of my scholarship are going to be really looking at teaching as a social practice. And that students, although they're familiar with the classroom environment, they're not familiar with teaching as a specialized practice. And how do we make that explicit to them? How do we let them see those internal mechanisms through these sort of things? But I don't think we're there yet. I think that sociological approaches offer really crucial insights that can enhance what we've learned from psychology about theories of learning and theories of knowing. And so it's for that reason that I've stumbled upon legitimation code theory when I was doing work on the initial teacher education research project. And I've really come to see that it provides me with some incredibly useful tools that help me to understand how knowledge works in teaching and knowledge practices. Every teacher is not just teaching nothing, they're teaching the practice of science or music or history. So they've got to know how practices work. And we as educators, teacher educators, have to know how practices work and how teaching practices work. And I'm using these tools because they have enabled me to compare teaching across different contexts, different groups of students, different subjects. It allows me to track the development of expertise from novice to expert and to see how complexity develops, to plan knowledge building over time. And knowledge building can be that time period, an activity, a lesson, a year of study, a course, an entire qualification, an entire career. And it provides me with a very principled and systematic way of identifying possibilities for improving teaching and improving teacher education. Through my contact with the LCT community internationally, teacher educators in Brazil, in Australia, in the UK, through the Teacher Advancement Network, Teacher Education Advancement Network, TEEN, I've come to have this realization that it's actually not just a South African concern. What we've been grappling with at an institutional level, at a national level, is actually a global issue as well for teacher educators all around the world. And it was just very interesting because when I did my PhD, there were very, very few teacher educators who were researching teacher education. Just a handful. And it was just so gratifying to see last year a systematic study on the most productive countries with scholarship, contributing scholarship in teacher education. And South Africa was recognized as one of the most productive countries. Far, far behind America, but we are really building up a research base. And I think that there's a really good reason for that. Because we as teacher educators have had to grapple with building a teacher education system in a university context that is principled, that is theoretically informed, that really tackles issues of equity, quality, but at the same time hold on really strongly to the knowledge project and the project of academic practices. And so I think that our research, and I'm talking collectively here, has been driven by these dual agendas of social justice and systematic learning. And we've made some incredible contributions that can feed into the Sustainable Development Goal number 4, about supporting the learning of teachers both in service and pre-service. And this is about to be released any day now. It's in press. The Journal for Education for Teaching has been running for 50 years. And Maureen and I and Marupeng were invited to contribute an article where we reflect on the last 50 years of teacher education in South Africa. And there, what we do is we really grapple with the struggle for social transformation through education and holding on to the idea of systematic learning, not just, oh, well, whoever sinks and swims, it doesn't matter. Yes, it does matter. Our country needs every single student who registers for teaching to become a quality teacher because our kids deserve it. Our schools need it. And we have a huge responsibility. And the work is not done. We've made strides, but the work is not done. There's lots to do. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Lee, for that brilliant lecture. I will not say much now, except to say, please come back. Because I've got something for you. You remember what the senior DVC said early on? That there's going to be a small token in appreciation of your big research and well done. Good. Okay. So before I call upon our guest, Professor Nadine Peterson, let me just say something about her so that we have a sense of the work that she does. So Professor Nadine Peterson is an accomplished teacher, educator, and a highly respected education researcher. She began a teaching career at Coronation High School and, like Lee, has devoted her career to using research to strengthen teacher education. She is currently the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Johannesburg. Much of her research focuses on service learning for teachers as well as preparing primary teachers for the classroom. A deep social justice agenda runs through Professor Peterson's work. She is concerned with supporting students from various contexts for academic and professional success. An inaugural award from the International Association for Research in Service Learning and Engagement recognized the excellent scholarship in service learning and community engagement. It is indeed a great honor to ask Professor Peterson to respond to Lee's inaugural address. Thank you.
Professor Rusznyak, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor to provide a short response to your address. In listening to Professor Rusznyak this evening, I am reminded about what Schulman wrote about professionals and, by implication, their training. And I quote, he said that professionals rarely can employ simple algorithms or protocols of practice in performing their services. How then does a professional adapt to new and uncertain circumstances? And here's the crux. She exercises judgment. And I think that's what you spoke about throughout what you said tonight. One might therefore say that professional education is about developing pedagogies to link ideas, practices, and values under conditions of inherent uncertainty that necessitates not only judgment in order to act, but also cognizance of one's actions. Professor Rusznyak advocates strongly for deepening theorizing about teaching practice so that it's conceptualized not merely as a site for enacting and assessing the performance of teaching and discrete teaching skills, but rather as a pedagogical reasoning space, a space where students can learn how to exercise professional judgment. Based on her research, she makes several arguments for how teaching practice could be shaped to enable this, and I address a few. First is the argument for the discipline to conceptualize a shift in the teaching practice space, a shift from performativity to becoming a thinking and knowledge generation space worthy of a student or a student teacher as an intellectual and as a thinking knowledge worker. Conceptualized in this way, we can generate pedagogical practice that, in the words of Giraud, create opportunities for students to take up subject positions with the principles of equity and justice in their teaching. It also changes the place of students' experience and voice in relation to formal theory and course content, so that these experiences become additional texts or perhaps even counter texts for understanding how disciplinary theory and practice are interwoven, or, as Lee has shown us, not interwoven in what they learn with us over 4 years in learning to become a teacher. And second, it promotes students to becoming active agents in constructing new kinds of knowledge and relationships, and allows role players the leverage, and by role players I mean students, student teachers, our learners, communities, school managers. It allows us the leverage to define and produce practice knowledge for teaching according to the different social, historical, and cultural contexts of the schools in which students will teach. This asks of us, and us, I mean us as teacher educators, to consider or reconsider the role of students, to see them not only as consumers of knowledge, but also as co-producers of knowledge in conjunction with others through activity and thoughtful reflection during their learning in teaching practice. As Brown, Collins, and Duguid remind us, it is the ordinary practices within a particular culture, the nature and purpose of which are framed by the socially constructed mediations and negotiations of its members, which are authentic and constitute a particular community of practice. And as Lee points out, it's precisely the reasons behind these practices which are often hidden from student teachers during their studies. It is only when students are in a cognitive apprenticeship that supports their learning in the situation that they are enabled to acquire, develop, and use the cognitive tools that she has spoken about this evening in authentic domain activity to shape the choices they make for teaching. These, if properly understood and practiced in the way that Lee entreats us to do this evening, could be the aspects which most influence student-teachers' learning and allows situated cognition to flourish. And in so doing, we could create the conditions for students to move from the periphery to the center of the disciplinary community, from the position of novice to the position of adaptive expert. At the beginning of her lecture, Lee asked a profound question of herself and of other teacher educators. She basically asked, what is needed to produce knowledgeable, ethical, and responsive teachers who offer quality education to every child they teach? Professor Rusznyak, in my view, you have established, through the body of your research, an epistemic warrant for rethinking the what, the how, and the why of teaching practice, in educating student teachers for the profession. And in a way, you've begun to answer your own question. Your research and arguments tonight help us to understand how to produce graduates who can transform educational practices in a way that serves the needs of all learners and creates the values that underpin a more humane and just society. You will have heard Lee speak a lot about we, because that's her nature. She works collaboratively, she works very well with others. But it's also indicative of her humility as a scholar. She's actually spearheaded, if I think about teacher choices in actions, she spearheaded and drove that process from beginning to end. I actually felt sorry for your family during that time, because I'm not sure they had any part of you in the hours that you put in. But as a field, we thank you for your leadership. We thank you for driving ideas that innovate in this space. So one last concluding remark from me. Prof. Rusznyak, I hold you in high regard. As a scholar, you are actively contributing to the development of what Schulman described as a signature pedagogy for teacher education. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Peterson. There's nothing that pleases a Dean of the Faculty of Humanities to hear from one of his colleagues who has just joined the professoriate, to hear that you dumped STEM subjects and you preferred to join the humanities. As a result, we are now the richer, and those STEM subjects and those faculties are now the poorer. And so, thank you very much for making that wise choice, Professor Rusznyak. It is a pleasure to have a colleague who started the way she shared with us and has finally become a member of the professoriate, a senior scholar, recognized for her teaching the teachers, like most of us do in the School of Education. But what we heard today was blowing that myth that people are born teachers, and just helping us to understand the interior view and indeed the ingredients that go into the mix of how one becomes a teacher. It is not a profession to be taken lightly. But the other thing that I admire about our own colleagues, our own teachers in the School of Education who teach teachers is that their teaching and learning is driven by research, is based on research, real experiential, well-researched, information that they then translate into teaching. Not so long ago, the School of Education itself was known for the wrong reasons, that it was purely a school that teaches teachers and nothing else. But I can tell you that there's so much research on teacher education that's coming out of this school. And Professor Rusznyak today is a living expression of that mix between research and teaching and learning. So, Professor Rusznyak, welcome to the professoriate. I shall not go on, I'm stopping here, and simply say thank you very much to your parents, to your family, to your friends, to our colleagues in the School of Education, in the faculty, and colleagues from other universities who came here to listen to you, and those who listen to you online. Thank you so much for this kind of support. It certainly means a lot for us. It means a lot, I'm sure, much more to Professor Rusznyak. With that, I would like to end the proceedings, and that's simply to say the official part of the proceedings. And as we stream out, please don't walk past the refreshments that have been prepared for you. Please finish all of them. Please do. Feel free to do that. So, thank you very much, everyone, and goodbye.